Because watching me paint for an hour and a half might be interesting, but not really that interesting. So I'll sort of talk through different series because I'm probably a little bit unusual as an artist in that I paint in multiple series very unapologetically. You know, like this painting may look totally different from the women that I do, and I've sort of bucked against that sense of you can only paint in one style. Because I think all of us as creative people have lots of things we want to say, and the worst thing you can do is sort of say, oh, I can't do that, I can't create that because it's not like everything else that I've made. And I think we all have to sort of push back a little bit more to say, no, I can create totally different things, I can explore new processes, and we should really encourage that sort of innovation. So to understand a little bit of my background as it influences my art is my background and degrees were not in art, even though I took art lessons all growing up, I took museum lessons, and I loved art. But it was always, don't become an artist because you'll never make a living as an artist, right? Like studying art was not a responsible thing to do, especially as a very academically oriented person. But I always kept that love, and it was always sort of a part of me. So I always had careers and experiences where I could use art. So I worked as an elementary school teacher. After graduate school, too, I was a child life specialist, so I worked in hospitals doing therapeutic play, and I did a lot of art activities in those settings. My graduate thesis used children's drawing, so art was sort of always a part of my story. I left teaching in child life to stay at home and focus more attention on my children because I have 3 sons. My oldest is 17 and just started his freshman year of college, and then I have a 13 and 10-year-old, all boys. And so I was kind of at home and I was like, it's time for me to pull out my paints again. I still have these, I still literally had my paints from high school. And I was like, I can make some things for my walls. And it sort of very accidentally evolved into a career as an artist. But my background being what it was, studying human development, relationships, so my master's is marriage, family, and human development really has influenced my work. And sometimes I'm really glad that I didn't just go to art school because I think studying the things I studied has really shaped and changed the way that I create art. And it makes it really meaningful and interesting to me. So I'm going to kind of walk you through pieces in each of the series that I do, some of the larger series. And I'll sort of talk a little bit about them. So this piece is from my volume series, and I brought one of those up here. And this series for me is a lot about sort of the exploration of individuals and our experiences and our narratives, like the stories of our lives, right? If we think about a way to visually represent the experiences that we've had, right? These defining moments, these tipping points, these individual chapters and experiences. So I love this as both an individual metaphor and as a collective metaphor. So as an individual metaphor, one thing that's fascinating to me is the intimacy of our minds, right? How many things do we think, feel, see, experience in a day that no one ever knows, right? Like even if you tried to tell someone else everything you thought in a day, you could never explain all of that. So each of us as individuals has these incredibly rich, unique experiences. And I wanted a way to sort of document all of those thoughts and feelings that we have in a visual way. And so that sort of sparked for me this series. And I also really liked it as a sort of collective communal metaphor of the necessity of someone else's story next to my story and the value of the diversity and richness and the juxtaposition of those things. So making this series, it sort of happened out of, because it's always sort of where do you get your ideas? Where does it come from? This idea came literally after I had been on a medical mission as a child life specialist in Jordan. And I had a conversation with a friend as we were hiking Petra about different books, different ideas, being idea people, basically. Because I'm an idea person. I love great ideas. And so this sort of need to communicate and share ideas. And that sort of got me thinking of books, and then I started thinking about, how do we represent who we are as people as a representation of our ideas? So that's kind of where this series started. Now, I also will sort of show you different variations, because I think it's important too, as you kind of continue in a career as an artist or as you move through things, that you look at different ways to explore a given image. Sometimes people feel like, oh no, I've done that once, I can't do that again. Well, part of the fun is really exploring how we can change and alter a concept in a different way. So for example, the piece on the left is a 10 by 20 painting. So in this case, I stacked the books. The piece next to it, while you can't tell because of the scale of the image, this painting is actually a 30 by 40 painting, so the books in this piece are incredibly large. So this was part of a triptych of giant volumes pieces that I did as a commission for a Beacon Hill apartment. And then these other ones are tiny volumes. They're just 6 inches. So in this display, you can see 12 of them. But these were just tiny little mini volumes. And these pieces were really fun for me to create because I would think I would either take a photograph or a memory of a certain place, and I would use the colors or the emotion of that particular event or experience to sort of determine the color choices. So they each had their own mood, their own experience with them. And so the technique for these two is a little bit different than a typical painting. These, the 2 paintings on the left are done on wood. I think it's also important to talk about like material shifts. So as you're sort of developing a piece or a series, if any of you don't know what I mean by material shift, it means sort of taking an idea but working with it in a different medium, sort of expanding it or stretching it in a different way. So in these pieces, I decided, hey, I can keep going on canvas, but what would happen if I worked on wood? What would happen if I used a poured resin finish, right? And so it creates actually a different feeling, which I'm not sure if you can sense it from these images, but the top one, there's almost a flattening when you put it behind the resin that's a little bit different than the textured feel that you get when it's on canvas. So to explain how I make these pieces, it kind of evolved in a really interesting way. So it started with the very first piece that I did was sort of depicting these books. And then I was sort of like, well, how am I going to embellish these books? How do I want to work with them? And so I kind of came up with an idea to work with the canvas in a different way. So I paint the spines of all the books, and then I painted on glassine, which I don't know if anyone knows what glassine is. You typically use it to wrap your paintings when you're dropping them off at a museum or an exhibit because it's archival, because it's not problematic with the pH of the painting and everything. So I was like, this could be a really interesting material to incorporate into the piece because it's basically like wax paper, if you think of it like that. That it had a certain translucency, transparency. And so I started painting all of these tiny little patterns and colors on the glassine, which I would then cut out and use a special paper adhesive to put on all of these positions. So it becomes this really fun process of sitting there on the floor with these giant cut-up scraps of all these hundreds and probably thousands of scraps, right? And because for some reason, I don't know why I don't just make big blocks of color to cut up, but every time I make these little tiny blocks of colors, little tiny patterns, there's something so intricate and individualized about that. And I really love the way even that technique sort of honors the experience of the individual. It's not about mass production. It's really about that creating these unique individual sections. And no one of the pieces in this series is ever the same. Each one is unique. Even if I sit down and think I'm going to make one similar to that, it turns out totally different because just the mood I'm in, the flavor, the balance, whatever it is, shifts according to that time. So it's the most fun project because you get to sit there and sort of play this game where you're constantly laying out all these parts and pieces, and it kind of becomes sort of almost an abstraction, that it just becomes like shapes and lines and patterns and mixing pieces together. And so it's a very, very enjoyable series to work on for me. My husband always thinks it looks very tedious, but I say no, it's fun. And so it's really about just an opportunity to express a lot of things and a lot of individuality through those pieces. So here's an example of my sketchbook. Now this is probably the neatest you'll ever see in a sketchbook for me. I think I used to always not want people to see my sketchbook because I'm not the type of person who ever does this like complete preliminary drawing, like whatever, like you think you're supposed to do in a sketchbook or anything like that. There really isn't a right or wrong to how you use your sketchbook. And in fact, if you see my sketchbook, you'll see sketchbook pages throughout this. You'll see that I use words, I have sizes, I have notes, I have all these things. There's often as many words as there are images in my sketchbooks, because that's how I tend to think. For me, there's an idea, there's a concept, I need to communicate it, but I need the words there because that's part of how I'm explaining or talking through to myself what I'm going to do in the piece. So here you can just see, this is where I'm exploring. What if I make them big? What if I arrange the shelves like this? What if I make them cubes? What if I do it in stacks? You know, what if I put them on an angle? What if I do 2 stacks? What if I jumble the books all together? So it's sort of that place where you get to brainstorm through a lot of ideas, a lot of compositions, and you can see, okay, sitting down for a few minutes and playing with these ideas has now generated, you know, weeks and months worth of potential paintings I could do. And I think sometimes this is a step that when people kind of come to painting or come to creating art, they sort of skip over, or they don't know how to start this, or they hear about sketchbooks, but they go, I don't really know how that fits for me. But what your sketchbook, or what the way that a sketchbook works for me, is really a place to just come up with ideas, a place to sort of roughly get a sense of something before I make it into something. So this was when I was brainstorming for a show I was doing. It was an all volumes show, so again, how much variation can I get because I have to keep people engaged in this exhibit that's all pictures of books, right? So it was like series of 4 that were going like this on white. I had 3 that were this size that were different. I had little tiny ones, I had resin ones, I had ones that were arranged in different ways because I really wanted to keep that interest and have it be visually interesting despite there not being a lot of diversity in the subject matter. So that gives it, but as you can see, this, as I said, this is probably one of the neatest pages you'll ever find in my sketchbook. It was probably because I was trapped on a plane while I was doing it, so I was probably giving it more attention than I normally do. You'll see messier ones as I come forward. So the domestic series is the next one that I put up here, which is probably what I'm most known for. So I had a solo exhibit at the Danforth Museum with these a few years ago, and they were in the Fitchburg Museum earlier last year. And then the Newport Art Museum had them in a big show this past year. So this series is a really interesting series. When I first started painting in this series, it started because I inherited some aprons that my great-grandmother had embroidered. She lived on a farm in Idaho, and they were these beautiful aprons. And one day I was wearing one of these aprons, and I had come home from church, and I was like sweeping in the kitchen, and I was thinking, I bet she wore this apron sometime when she was sweeping her kitchen. And now I'm wearing it while I'm sweeping my kitchen. Like, this is kind of weird because our lives are very, very different places. But I thought, you know, it would be really interesting to do this painting. And the idea actually came to me while I was sitting in a doctor's office because I had very little kids at the time. And I didn't have a lot of time when my brain could think thoughts through without interruption. And I thought, oh, that would be so interesting to do these paintings where you couldn't totally see who the figure was, and you couldn't totally place the figure because it could kind of be me, or it could kind of be her, or it could kind of be any of the women in between me and my great-grandmother. And I wanted to sort of play with that and evoke these questions of women's identity, how we view domestic work, how that's shifted, again, going back to my own graduate studies in sort of how we view domestic work, women's identity, women's roles, all of these things. And so I thought, you know what, this would be a really interesting series to do. So I decided to do a photo shoot of me sweeping, wearing that apron in the kitchen. And I did that piece and I really liked it. I was like, there's something about this piece that I really like. It was actually cropped a little lower. And so I was like, why don't I do another one? So I did a second one. And I was like, I really like that one too. And then I did a third one. And this time my second son, who was probably like 4 at the time, was like, Mom, I can go and get you another canvas to put on top because you keep running out of room for the heads. Like, he was like, Mom, like, I'm getting kind of embarrassed for you. You keep doing these, and every time the same thing's happening. And I was like, no, it's on purpose. And so these decisions to do these paintings this way was a lot about I wanted to obscure the identity of the individual, because when you see a portrait, you automatically have some sort of reaction to that. You think the figure is beautiful, you don't, it reminds you of someone, it doesn't. It generates a different emotional reaction. And what I wanted was this to not be about an individual, but to be a larger discussion about women, about women's experiences. How does the meaning of it change if you think of it in a context 50 years ago? How does it change if you think of it in a context 30 years ago? How does it change if we look at it now? And I've had women say, this reminds me of my grandmother, or this reminds me of my mother, or this reminds me of myself now because I come home from work and I'm doing all these tasks and yet I'm still dressed from work. And so to me it was really interesting to see how in many ways some of these domestic tasks remain very constant even though our lives and other things have changed. And how did we find this space? I looked at my great-grandmother, or even my grandmother, who really wanted to be a fashion designer, but instead wound up living with her husband on a farm in Idaho and owning a fabric store, right? Like that was her way to sort of live that dream and that opportunity, because going to New York to be a fashion designer wasn't really a viable option for her at that time. And so I thought about the investments of those women in their domestic lives that brought many of us to the places that we are today. And where is that space between honoring those investments and their experiences without devaluing them as women have more opportunities and experiences today? And so to me there's a lot of sort of shifts in what does it mean when we outsource domestic work? How does that impact our sense of identity? How does that impact how we view family life? Again, going back to my graduate studies. So this series has been very fun to do. People often ask me different questions. I had one client that I was doing a commission piece for in this series, and she said, now it's so interesting for me to see these women. What are the names of all the women? And I said, the names of all the women is Leslie. Because the way that this series started out was, okay, I need a model. I have to take this picture to do this painting. And so I was like, well, I'll just use myself because it's, I'm telling this story about my great-grandmother's apron. And then I did the second piece and the third piece, and I got to this point of like, okay, well, I guess I can recruit all of my friends, and bring them over to my house and make them be in these photo shoots for me, or I can hire models. And as I thought through this, I thought also about what I wanted to say. And one thing coming out of social science research is one of the things that I love about feminist frameworks is it encourages us to speak from first person, right? It doesn't have to be this detached relationship of like researcher and subject. There's more of this promoting a sort of qualitative experience, but also speaking from first person. So I said, okay, I have to make a decision in this series. Am I going to keep using myself, or am I going to use other people? And I really, in many ways, wanted to use other people because I wanted there to be more diversity in the women, because oftentimes people will say, well, why are they all white? And I just tell them because it's actually a self-portrait series. So as much as I would love to represent different people, I also wanted to represent authentically something that I could speak to. And so for me, each of these pieces has sort of metaphors that inherent in a lot of our daily activities are metaphors. So this piece is titled Stirring Things Up. So it's literally a woman stirring things up, but it's also about voice. It's about our opportunity to create change, our opportunity to speak to things that are important, our ability to agitate or to sort of disrupt the status quo, right? To stir things up in not necessarily negative ways, but to use personal power in positive ways. So for me, this is one of my favorite pieces in the series that I've never sold because it was really important to me. I found it's like if you were to ask me which piece is probably a self-portrait of me, I would say this piece because I think it really captures a lot of who I am as a person. Another piece that's up here is titled She Wanted to Get Out. And this one is, of course, kind of interesting because the banister railings sort of act like bars and sort of a cage. And so a lot of people are like, whoa, she's making these crazy statements about women being trapped in domesticity, and which is true. I love for my pieces to have multiple levels of meaning. Like, none of them are wrong. I intentionally create work that is open-ended because I want other people to find their meaning and their experiences in the work. So for me, this piece was also about, at the time I had a woman who was a friend of mine, and I was so frustrated because I watched her be trapped by her own self-defeating behaviors. And I thought, how many times do we as individuals want to get out, but really we're the ones that are putting up these barriers? We're seeing ourselves with these limitations. We're saying, well, I can't do that because of this. And so this piece was not only a sort of a cultural, social exploration, but an individual exploration to times in people's lives where they want to get out, but what's really holding them back. So this was a fun piece, and as I said, these explore sort of a lot of different things. Now, to know another thing about these pieces is these are set up in my house. All of them have either been, the scenes have been in my house, my parents' house, or my best friend's house. So here's some other examples from the series. I occasionally throw in a few men. My husband gets to be the model and sit on our couch and ask me when I'm done taking pictures and tell him to move his hand or whatever. Although people always say, the men are always just sitting there doing nothing and the women are working. And I say, I make better food. So here are two examples of material shifts in this series. So the first one is actually on wood with resin. So this is a smaller piece. I did a series of these. So you can see anywhere where there's skin, it's not painted. It's actually the wood that's showing through for the figure, and they're outlined. And the bottom ones are sewn. So what I did was I drew the image on flat canvas, and then I went through with a sewing machine and I sewed all of the outlines, and you'll see the threads coming off because I left all the threads. And then I went back and painted in the areas that I wanted to paint for those pieces. So those were two sort of fun material shifts, because you think, how far can you go from a painting like this to a new place? But that's sort of a fun, it's fun to sort of put yourself through that experience of coming up with extensions, coming up with a new way to do it. How else could I do this, right? I could create sculptures, or I could create mixed media collages, or how many different things could I do with this? This series is very characterized by flat color. As you'll notice, it tends to be very flat, discrete patches of color, and that's because I'm also very influenced by 1950s, 1960s periodical lifestyle illustration. I love that. I loved that really interesting focus where a lot of illustration at that time was focused on relational themes. Like if it was in McCall's or it was in whatever, it would be this really interesting illustration. It was really a great age of illustration, followed by these, stories and different things. So I loved that. And it sort of subconsciously influenced the way that I created these pieces. And each of the pieces sort of has some sort of mid-century element, whether it's an old magazine. It has something that sort of blurs the historical context and allows you to sort of shift between when is this piece, what is she saying, what is she doing. This is actually my laundry room up here with the checkerboard floor that has these cabinets in it. And I have to say that the day I was doing that photo shoot, a guy came to change out our water meter, and he wondered why I was running around in an apron with a knife and making a salad in my laundry room. But I was like, this is what you do for art. So this is much more representative of what it looks like in my sketchbook. It is not neat. These are not perfect drawings. These are not anatomical. This is not like I'm doing figure drawing at the museum and practicing my skills. It is little scribbles. It is fast little things where I'm trying to figure out what's going to be in this composition, right? Where are the figures going to be placed? What's the interaction of figures? Oh, I think I'm going to do this one with cakes because I was doing some new pieces for the Newport exhibit last year. And I was like, I want one with cakes. So what cakes am I going to bake that I'm going to like the pattern of to go with the figure? So I'm literally drawing what kind of cake I'm going to make over there on the left, how I'm going to place those. You'll see words. I can read them if I'm up here. Like it'll say things like mixing bowls or glass canisters or pink, red, white, chocolate and green, or like all these different things. I'm just making notes in my head as I get ideas of what I think I might like, or color schemes I might want. Because if you actually see Domestic Series, when I first did it, I did 30 pieces, and I wouldn't sell any of them until I exhibited all 30 together. And so it was really cool because each one kind of had its own color theme, but like the figure sort of remains consistent. That was actually also one thing with choosing to remain the model in all the pieces. It creates a really interesting consistency across the series that allows you to change the scene, the colors, everything else, but it creates a consistency across the series that actually really works to unify it. But as you can see, these are very sloppy, scribbly, 2-second drawings that are about this big that help me figure out what's going to go into a piece. So don't feel bad. So then I have to do a photo shoot, which photo shoots are more work than you think they are. But it usually involves me getting dressed. Sometimes I will put on a wig because sometimes I don't want my hair in the way. And taking hundreds of pictures. Like for any given shot, I'd probably take 250 pictures. And then I have to sit there and say, do I like my hand here or here? Do I like the body here or here? And you just, I sit there. And half the time I take them with a remote, with a 3-second timer. So then I have to like quick stick it in my bra or throw it on the floor or somewhere so it's not in the shot, right? And I get back into the pose. So then I go through images and I decide which one of these really, of those ideas that I sort of had, that I sketched out, which one of those really conveys what I want to say. Sometimes I'll use more than one image from a photo shoot. So for example, this one ended up being that piece that I showed the painting of. But there's another one of a woman walking down the stairs that I'm probably going to do in a new piece for a show that's coming up in February. So sometimes I'll go back to those and say, oh, I still really like that image. I want to use that. It conveys something different. And so sometimes I'll adapt them from there. But that's kind of the process that I go through. And it's actually really exhausting to do photo shoots. I don't do more than generally 3 to 4 different scenes at a time, because I literally am like, I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired of thinking like, okay, am I in the right position? Am I holding this right? Because one of the really difficult things with this is to have that consistency of never showing past here, that I have to be sure the composition works with that crop. So for example, this week, which I almost brought it tonight, I brought it to my class the other day, and I brought a half-done piece because I think it's really important for people to see work when it's not perfect yet. Work when it's still in that awkward adolescent phase where when you're working on your piece at home and you think, this looks terrible, like it looks awful. And all pieces look like that when they're at that stage. And it's really funny because when I do commissions for clients, I'm always hesitant to send them something when it's not done, because they'll look at it and think, oh, and you just go, well, I know what's coming next. You don't know what's coming next. Like, you don't know that this is only one coat of paint, and so it really doesn't look very vibrant right now. You don't know that, this is just where I'm blocking in the colors. This is just, starting to lay down the very basic parts of things, and that's just the process. I generally paint in a few layers, so I prefer to sort of paint in a thinner layer, see how I'm liking that, and then sort of tweak the colors. Like, no, I want to push that up. No, I want to like tone that down. I want a little warmer. I want a little cooler. So, so for me, that first coat is just sort of like making sure I'm happy with where everything's going. And then that second coat and that third coat is really where it like pops the piece out. So today I was working on a bathtub. And one of the hard things in this photo shoot was it's a 24 by 48, so it's a long shot. And I'm in the bathtub sideways. So my legs are up, but I couldn't, have my legs up higher than where my mouth is, and trying to get them above the edge of the tub, but be sure my head's up enough, but not enough of the rest of me, that I'm showing more than I want, and the bubbles are staying on top. Like, I actually had to go and buy a bubble bath at Target, and a new, make sure I had green soap and not white soap, so it would show up well. And so, there's a lot that goes into creating a photo shoot, and I think sometimes it's easy to think, oh, I'll just find an image, I'll just whatever. But really in that act of creating that, you give a lot more voice and control to the piece. And a lot of what makes the piece ultimately work is that work that goes in ahead of time, right? Like for me, that ideating, coming it up with Like I actually drew, because I wanted a tile background in my bathtub, which I don't have. So I actually drew with washable Crayola markers on the sides of my bathtub with a yardstick, so that when I took the picture, I would have the right perspective. Like you're all thinking, yeah, I know, my husband just shakes his head. I was putting tape marks on the floor so I could get individual like tile paths, right? Like these are the things you do, and it sounds crazy, but it ultimately is what makes the painting work, right? But it's thinking through that ahead of time to be like, oh no, how am I gonna make this tile look like it's tile if I have no sense of how much that distorts, what the perspective is gonna be, based on the depth of the tub, because I could hack it afterwards, but it's not gonna look quite right. And if I want it to look right, I need to be sure that I have a way to make it look right. So this series I can talk about forever. So again, here's an example of the photo from the photo shoot.
I say you couldn't.
And Siri is telling me things. No, I didn't say anything to you. And this is an example of the finished piece. So you can see that it's pretty close. Like I eliminated the mirror that was above my head. But other than that, it's pretty representative of what was in the piece. So for me, I would rather get the photo shoot right than be changing a lot of things from there. Sure, it's a reference image, but again, the more you make that correct from what you want to work on, the less you get into the piece and are trying to fake something that's not really there, and then it looks like it's off because you weren't really paying attention to the lighting on that pillow or the glare on that and where your light source was coming from and all of that. So for me, but the really cool thing was I didn't know this when I painted this series. In fact, I didn't discover a whole wealth of information on lifestyle illustrators of the 1950s and 60s who I decided were my tribe and my people, even though I was born much too late for that. But one of the most interesting things I found years after I had started this series, so I started this series I think 8 or 9 years ago, and I've probably done 60 or 70 paintings in it. Very few of them I still own, and I'm actually just starting a new set, which you'll see this one that has patterning in the background. I was like, I'm gonna break into that because, well, when I talk about the desserts, we'll get into that. But this series just has really evolved in a lot of respects. But as I studied these mid-century illustrators, I read something that talked about their process, and he was like, this is how they would do it. They would find a space, rent furniture, hire the models, get the fashion designers. They would have the people all set up. They would take pictures. They would go develop the film. They would push one to a super high contrast so that they could, when you're doing illustration, you say, what are my darkest darks? What are my lightest lights? Then they would create and they would paint in acrylic because they had to finish the painting so that they could be ready for the magazines. If they painted in oils, they didn't have that much time. And that was how they did their work. And I was like, you know what? This is really similar to the process that I've evolved. It's no wonder that our paintings look kind of similar, even though it wasn't something I had intentionally tried to pattern going into it. It was just naturally where I gravitated to. Okay, so here's an example too. When I had an exhibit at the Fitchburg Museum, we actually put there's a little learning lounge where people can come and understand more about the process of the work. So we actually put the objects that were in the photo shoots in pieces in the museum in the little glass case. So my shoes were there, my purse was there. The yellow Tupperware canisters that some of you here may totally recognize, there was like the yellow, and there was the harvest gold, the avocado green, the orange. Right, I have an orange set and a yellow set, and I really love them. The apron, like all of these things so that people could see really what goes into the process of this that helps the paintings to be successful. Because I think way too many times people think, like as an artist, you just sit down at the canvas and these visions come to you and you just put your brush to the canvas and it magically appears, right, without thought, without planning, without references, without any of these things, which totally isn't true. And I think and so many times people will say, well, you just have so much talent. No, I do a lot of work, right? Like you may have certain abilities or inclinations or a good aesthetic sense, but there's a lot of work that goes into art. And that's the part that I always want to help people see, that you too can actually probably do some form of art, because I think everyone actually can if they find the right medium, the right fit. that goes with their personality and what they like to do. But it is a lot of work. Over here, I'm just working on a painting, and you can see again, it's very discreet, flat paint, but I love that. I love the sort of visual blend or the visual sense of form that takes place. So the next series that I have is my dessert series. So this is called Just Desserts. And this actually evolved from doing domestic paintings because I was doing a domestic piece that had a cake in it and this cake stand. And I was like, I love painting this stainless steel cake tender and cake stand like more than I love painting anything else in this painting. So I was like, if I love painting this cake so much and I love eating cake and I bake a lot, I was like, why don't I just paint a big cake? So at first I thought maybe I should do it like 4 feet by 4 feet. And then I was like, maybe I should rein that in. Let's go 3 feet by 3 feet. So I was like, okay, I'm going to make this cake. But again, I was like, I'm going to follow the same process that I do for a domestic thing. So I make the cake and I set it up in my kitchen. This is my white table. And this was actually, so I told you about the great-grandmother who made the aprons and then the grandmother who owned the fabric store. Well, this was the wrapping paper that they had in their fabric store in the 1940s and 50s, that they would wrap all the packages that went out in. And so they had this big roll of it left. So when I was growing up, our Christmas presents always arrived wrapped in this lovely mid-century wrapping paper. We always knew exactly who it was from. But I had this little scrap of it, and I loved it because it always reminded me of my grandparents. So I was like, why don't I put this behind the cake, like wallpaper? Well, then at first I thought maybe I'm crazy because this is going to be so tedious painting this pattern. And then I started working on it, and I found I loved painting the pattern even more than I loved painting the cake. Like, that was my favorite part. And then I'm like, dang it, now I have to paint the cake. Like, the pattern's all done. But the pattern is actually probably 5 or 6 layers in every area to get the paint that vibrant. Because when I paint these, I actually paint the whole canvas gray, and I work from a gray toned ground, because if you look at it really closely, and you can do this afterwards, you can even touch the pieces. I have no problem with that. Unlike in a museum where you can't. You can see the gray, you can see the pencil lines, and especially where this pattern, I was like, I can either get so fussy with it that I have to reach every tiny little spot, or I can leave that gray so that it almost creates, from a distance, a sort of outlining, but it's not these glaring white little bits showing through. And it also meant that, like, when I do the white down here, this is probably 8 or 9 layers of white, because on top of that gray, it just keeps, soaking out the white. But it also really lets you create a much different spectrum of whites, right? Because you're building off of the gray. So it helps you to create more midtones, more highlights, that are rich. But again, this is actually my arm here because I'm taking a picture and it's reflected in this cake tender. But so that's sort of how this series started. Now to talk about this, we can even just set it here. Now to talk about this piece, and the title of this is You Want a Piece of Me. And which could be a very provocative title. It's you have this open cake with this piece taken out of it, but the truth is I'm a really busy person. I kind of have these multiple simultaneous careers as an artist. I still do medical missions and train physicians around the world as a child life specialist, so I leave for New York tomorrow to present at a conference. So I kind of do these other things. I have these 3 children. I'm involved in all sorts of things. And for me, it was really this visual representation of my life. So like there's 24 hours in a day. I have a cake, and it's this big. And you could cut it into however many pieces you wanted, but there's still just so much cake. Just like there's 24 hours in a day, and I can divide it into 15-minute increments or 1-hour increments, but there's still just 24 hours in the day. And so it was really about that conflict or constant decision-making or deliberateness in my life when it's like all these things are asking for my attention, and I have to decide who gets it, right? Do my children get it? Does this committee get it? Does this, the cultural council that I'm on get it? Does, teaching at the Danforth get it? Like, I have to make these decisions all the time. And so I was like, that's something that I think a lot of us can understand and speak to. So for me, these pieces are about taking emotional, social, cultural experiences that we have in our lives and representing them in metaphor. And also it means making cakes, getting to write it off as a business expense, getting to eat them, which my kids are always like, are you done with the photo shoot yet? So we can eat the cake. So these are 2 others that are in the series. The one on the left is titled How It Looked in the Reflection. And this is really a piece about body image, which again, you'd be like, what? Cake, body image? Coming, again, from the background that I come from, I love, and I work a lot with populations of visible differences. So people with vascular anomalies who look different. And a major factor in their life is people see them as they look and not as they are. And so this piece for me was really about how we see people and how we see ourselves. And so I love that there's the cake, but we've taken a piece of the cake, and then you see this distorted reflection of this tiny little part of the piece of the cake in the back, in the mirrored surface of the cake tender. And the way that we often see ourselves is like that little distorted part of the piece that's in the cake tender, when really we're the thing that you can't even see, that's this whole present, bigger thing than that. So that's that piece. Then the other piece that I brought over here is titled Glass Ceiling. So again, it's sort of speaking to the experiences of women, but I love taking this, like baking as a traditionally female domestic art, and using it to also speak to sort of social issues that are contemporary to women's lives and experiences. And this piece is actually pretty funny, because if you want to appreciate my commitment to the work, you can come up and look at it afterwards. But I found this fabric and I was like, I love this, this is gorgeous, I'm going to use this in the photo shoot. And I did a photo shoot and I'm so happy with the pieces, and I'm going to draw up the piece, and I get to notice the ball on the top of the cake tender. And if you know anything about optics, if you take like a glass sphere, if you've ever looked at a marble, right, it takes whatever you're looking at and it distorts it, right, fisheye, and it inverts it. And the pattern, if you look at this pattern for very long, you'll see it's actually a really odd pattern, because it doesn't just step, and some rows don't have all the colors. So it's not just like, oh, the yellows move up one, the reds move down one. So it was this constant shift of patterns. But then I had to take that pattern, and it's inverted and fisheye, distorted. So I'm making all, and I was like, oh, I do not want to paint these tiny, tiny, tiny dots all on just this, upper part right here of the glass ball. But I have to do it, because if I don't, somebody's going to tell I totally hacked my way through this painting. So when you want to see my commitment to the piece, I was sitting there having to recite the patterns in my head, like yellow, orange, green, gray, turquoise, yellow, orange. Right? Over and over again, trying to maintain the flipped pattern and the everything. So sometimes you run into things that you don't really want to do, but you stick with it for the sake of the piece. So here's some other pieces. Again, so we have balancing act, again, speaking to sort of the things that we have to balance. The chocolate cake piece was really fun because it was this bundt cake, and I loved this wavy pattern fabric, and it's called Amid the Ups and Downs. So it's a lot about resilience, about experiences in our lives, and I loved how it's just this dark cake, but it's amid this this flowing pattern that I think all of us can really speak to, or that experience. Or the pie that's down here, her piece of the pie. This was actually the pie I made for my 40th birthday dessert. The really funny part was I made this pie, I ate the pie, I was working on the painting, and I was so hungry for pie that I couldn't finish the painting until I made another pie to eat, because I just kept wanting to eat strawberry pie. So they are very personal to me, the cakes, the recipes, and sometimes when I've done shows with these, a number of them were in the Newport Art Museum, I did a show at Arts Worcester, I actually make the cakes for the openings that go with the dessert. So people get to taste them and see the paintings. And again, this is what my sketchbooks sort of look like. It's a lot of playing through different ideas. There's some that are on here I'm trying to think of. I have one that I was doing that was a piece that I sold. It was called Gilded Cage, so it's like a very tall glass pedestal with this golden band around it, because I wanted to play with that sense of sort of sometimes the way money or what, like the impacts, you know, as the term gilded cage implies, but using this metaphor. I have another one you'll see up at the top with these two pieces that's sort of about comparison, competition and comparison in our culture and in society, because I'm a very cooperative and not competitive person, and I really wish that people could see that there's really no difference between themselves. Everyone just has different strengths and abilities. So I love using these foods to tell stories, to talk about experiences that we all have, and I think that brings a different richness to the work. So I'm always on the lookout for patterns, how I want the patterns to integrate with the pieces. Again, like this one, you have the ball, so it goes really well with those, with the polka dot background, you know, other ones, and they just each have their own flavor and identity. So it does mean making the cakes. This was one day when I was like, I'm going to make a bunch of mini desserts. I then sent them all with my son to take to school. I had his friends were like sending little Snapchats like, I want the pink one. I want the like. So I tried to create as many different looking mini cakes as I possibly could in one day with various sprinkles and frosting colors and berries and things that I could, you know, concoct. So then again, this is just setting them up, creating an arrangement, taking the picture, working off of that to create the painting. So again, here's like examples of fabric patterns, wrapping papers, things like that I may use as an inspiration for the patterns behind it. And really, painting the patterns is the most fun part. And if you come to my studio and you see me paint, I do not sit in an easel in this like, I sit on the floor, which is very strange because I prefer to paint flat. Sometimes I sit at a desk because I'm trying to rehabilitate myself, but I mostly sit on the floor because I tend to paint pretty big and it's hard to paint flat, and I'm constantly moving and shifting and turning the canvases around. So it looks like this. There's generally just my carpet. I think I had that down because I was varnishing another painting, but it's just, I sit on the carpet, light white carpet, and I paint, and there's brushes everywhere and paints. And the problem is if I get really into a painting, I have a big studio in my house, and the painting will literally migrate across the floor because I keep moving to fresher and cleaner space, leaving a trail of paints all behind me until I'm like reaching like 4 feet over to put my brush in the water. And so I don't, when I get into a piece, I don't even pay attention to all of those things. I just work on it. But here you can see the gray underneath the cake, where I'm still working on that. And this painting was actually funny because the background was actually a lot of bright colors. And I started on it, and I hated it. And it sat in my studio in the corner. When I don't like a piece, I just put it in the corner until it's ready to behave. And it was not, and it had oranges, and it was not working. And one day I was like, it was late at night, I was finishing another piece, and I was like, what if I just made everything in these like blues, greens, and purples? And so I brought it over, and I just started taking out all the oranges and all the reds, and suddenly the piece just worked, right? So sometimes I just have to sit, and then it sort of evolves. And sometimes, like, this was one I was super excited to do, and I was like, it's gonna look great, and then I just got into it, and it was like, it was not working. So sometimes it just takes time for pieces to evolve to what they're going to be. So here's an example of one of the cakes before we start cutting it from one of the shows that it was in. So sorry, they should have put in a request that I would bring you a cake to go with them. Okay, so the next series I'm going to talk about is my Rewind series. And this has been a new series that I worked on last year. One of the pieces, it's similar to the mixtapes that are over here. Or you can stack it in front of this. So again, this was interesting to me. This piece up here, not that glasses are an old thing, although fewer people wear glasses now than ever used to. And this piece was really personal to me, and things that were going on in my life at the time. And I really like this piece because it's a piece that's a lot about individuals and compassion and how we judge them. And so it's titled All the Things We Cannot See. How each of us sort of has, because of our own experience, things that we're blind to, things that we're not aware of, things that we don't understand in other people. But one of the greatest commonalities that we share is that we're all blind in different things, right? Or just like in our lives, sometimes we make stupid choices, but it's because something else is right in front of us and we kind of can't see past it. And so I really wanted a way to explain to my children, especially, how to be more gentle with other people, how to think about other people in ways that are more compassionate, in ways that you can see we're all flawed, just in different ways. And we all have to give each other a break, and we all have to realize everyone's trying. And when other people do things to you too that may hurt your feelings or not seem right, it's because there's things they can't see. And so it was really, I loved sort of using this sense of a typology, repeating an object, but in lots of different variations of that, to sort of represent individual identity. And so these pieces are different because a lot of the work in this series is done on wood with resin. So I actually paint, I draw, well, first I actually coat the wood in a satin varnish, because if not, and I get any paint in a place I don't want it, I either have to sand it off or it's really hard to get off. And sometimes I'm not that precise. So I put a satin varnish on so that if I get a little bit somewhere, I can just take nail polish remover and get that little spot off that I didn't want there. And then I draw and paint, and then I put an epoxy resin on the top. And I really like the look and the aesthetic that I get in those pieces. So okay, so here's other pieces in the series. I've done a series of phone booths. I love telephones because I think they speak to some other really important emotional things, like the sense of like it used to be, right, growing up in a time when you didn't just have, not that there's anything wrong with cell phones, I love my phone, but before you had like an answering machine or anything like that, there was this sense of presence, right? Somebody would try to call you, and if you missed it, you missed it. And I love the way that speaks to certain things in our lives. If we're not there, if we're not present, there's things you can miss. You can't just call back on everything in life, right? You can't just get around to it. So for me, they really evoke a sense of presence and a sense of connection, a sense of communication and human relationships. It's really fundamental to me. Boombox pieces are, this one's titled Take It to the Streets, and I really like sort of using a hip-hop pop culture icon to also talk about voice, protest, things that are happening in our world, contemporary politics today. Come on. I think I'm using the wrong finger. Okay, so I love to do mixtapes. One, because I grew up in the age of making mixtapes, like in college, where you would wait for that song to come on the radio, and then you would hit record, and you would try to make this perfect thing, and you would take them on road trips, and you had all these memories associated with these mixtapes. And the way that these were sort of artifacts of your experience, right? They were very emotional, and I would have people in shows who'll be like, I had this tape, and I made a mixtape for this girl so-and-so that I liked on that tape. And so there, I had this tape, and I can tell you what was on it, and this one that we used to play on road trips, and this one that my best friend had in college that had this mixtape. And so I loved taking these things that represent much more significant things in our lives and incorporating them into an image. And the title of this piece is, Do You Want to Rewind, Fast Forward, or Eject? Because for me, each of us, there's sort of certain existential experiences that we all feel. One, we want to go back to a different time in our lives, right? Or sometimes we want to hurry up and get to a different point in the future in our lives. Or sometimes we just want out of our experience, or we want out of some element of our life. And we're like, that's something that every single person can relate to. And that's something that these objects perfectly capture, right? They're this perfect metaphor for that. And also, as a woman, I was talking about this series with some friends, and I said, for me too, this series, because there's always multiple levels. Some of them I share publicly. Sometimes there's things I keep to myself, like little things that I know is why I painted a painting, but no one else knows. But one of the things that I loved about this piece was we were talking about women and women's experiences and different things, and I said, sometimes we're like the mixtape, right? Like, we don't get to be the MP3 today that has this same functionality, but you would never have gotten there without us. But part of our experiences were still limited by certain things. And so like embracing that role for what we are and those cool things that were unique about what it was to be a woman growing up in the age that I grew up in. But then as I sometimes look at other experiences from other people, I say, oh, but look at how much farther we've come. Look at how much better we've made that. But accepting sort of sometimes our place in evolution, our place in social cultural evolution, that is sometimes an interesting and difficult place to navigate. So I also like to do calculators, and I love them because we always think of numbers as being so infallible, right? And so these are often titled like miscalculated, or it didn't add up, right? Because there's a lot of things in life that just don't go right. They just don't. Or we like fallibility. I think fallibility, again, is this universal human experience. How do we represent that? That in life, we all make mistakes. Like, it just doesn't work sometimes. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, it just doesn't work. So these pieces are really fun because I love the like sensory experience as a child. I still love like the feeling of typewriters. I had an old phone out the other day, and my son was like, how does it even work? And I was like, you just keep going all the way around until it stops, and then you let go, and then the next number, all the way around until it stops. But I miss those, and I have so many memories of those sensory experiences. Like, I did one that was the remote control for our old Zenith television. It was this big chunky remote, and I still remember like the texture of the buttons under my finger. But like the painting is about authoritarian control, right? Like, what a better symbol of authoritarian control and power than a remote control, right? So it's fun to take these objects, but then make them more powerful in the things that we say. So again, here's my sketchbook where I'm sort of playing with the typology, playing with the format. What am I going to use? What's going to go in this? These are the actual videotapes that I dug out of a trunk in our house and stacked them up to take the picture, to do the photo shoot that later became this painting. You can see it sort of in process there on the gray toned ground. And that's kind of how it came to be. So that's kind of what I was going to share with you about the pieces. And just a few more things that I would say to people who are sort of wanting to continue to grow and develop in their work, or find ways to incorporate that meaning that maybe you have from your life into your work. Because sometimes I think people feel a disconnect between, or they feel drawn to paint something because it's beautiful, and that's fine. There's lots of reasons we can create art. And as we look at aesthetic, there's many different aesthetic lenses. But sometimes it's also trying to say, how can I make my work even more a part of who I am? What am I passionate about? What do I know a lot about? And how do I integrate that in even more powerful ways into my work to make it more meaningful to me and even to other people? Like, I often say that too many times, especially student artists, it's always funny because when I do work with different art schools, and a lot of students are still in this stage where they just think, I'm creating art and I'm using my voice, and then there's also the part they think, so people should love it because it's authentic and it's real. And then you also have to tell them, but you know, what makes art powerful is when someone else can connect with what you're saying, right? When someone else can say, I know how you feel, right? When I say, this is what this piece is about, and you go, I felt that, right? Then that connection with the work grows and increases and it strengthens. And so sometimes it's like helping students realize you can create that work that you want all day long for yourself. But if you want to create art that's powerful, art that's moving, it's often beyond just an aesthetic thing or the authenticity of your voice. But the greatest thing is when you can maintain that authenticity of voice, but you can have a way that it connects it to other people. The other people can say, I get that, I feel that, I understand that it evokes thought and emotion in other people. And so that's really something that I like to help people know how to do, because I think it's something we don't talk about as much in art. Lots of us can say, I love this image, it looks pretty, I want to paint it, but how do you tap even more into what's inside of you and bring that into your work that gives it a unique voice, that gives it a unique style, that you say, you know what, I'm just going to try this. I have never put a pattern in the background of a domestic before, but I was like, I love doing patterns on my desserts. So why don't I try putting it in some domestics? Now, I could get scared and be like, oh, I don't know, But I was like, no, so this one is actually going to be this whole sort of like contemporary, subtle Adam and Eve analogy reference. So there's this like whole tropical garden wallpaper. She's holding this like two-tiered like mid-century tray of fruit. And so it's this very different, like contemporary interpretation of a very classical subject matter. But I was like, oh, when the idea came to me, I was like, she was holding this fruit, and I was like, oh, I've got to put this tropical wallpaper on the background, because it just evokes this whole other level of metaphor and imagery that opens it up to a whole other discussion in the piece. So I think those are the things that, as I work with students, as I teach, I really encourage people to do, because I know I've found that when a curator comes to my house, when they talk to me about a show, those are the pieces where they just go, I can't wait to show this work. I can't wait to talk about this work. I can't wait to write about this work, because there's ways for people to connect with it in different ways. And I think that that's one thing that we can do as artists that help to change people's experiences. And I think sometimes we think changing the world is in big things, and I think life is a lot about little things. It's about those little things that we do each day that ultimately accumulate to make our lives what they are. And so in just these very small and simple ways, we can talk about things that matter to us. We can make people feel more connected. We can make people feel more valued. We can see our lives as interesting and beautiful. And sometimes, as I paint domestic paintings, it's often work that's never seen as glamorous, but things that have been done for millennia and generations, and often goes unnoticed, but is often some of the most meaningful or connecting pieces of our lives, as it's in relational contexts or in caregiving or doing things for other people. And so I love to speak to those. And as I said in the beginning, I think if I hadn't studied the things I had studied, I wouldn't have the framework or the mindset that I have. So I think it's really about looking at the things you're passionate about. What are you drawn to? What do you love? What experiences are the most meaningful to you in your life? And emotionally, where are you in your life? How can you speak to that? How can you honor the experiences that you live through in ways that sort of immortalizes them and makes sense of them? I think, too, coming from a therapeutic background as a child life specialist, one of the big things we do is coping. How do you get through, you help children in hospitals with grief, trauma, loss, medical conditions. How do you make things easier? And for me, one of the experiences that kind of got me back into painting was I had my first son, and then I had 7 miscarriages over the course of 3 years. So I would get about 10 weeks into the pregnancy, and then I would lose the pregnancy, and I'd start all over and be sick and throwing up every day, and 10 weeks in and I would lose, and it was a really difficult thing for me to get through. And as I struggled with, I even led pregnancy loss groups, I wrote articles, I was doing all these things to cope with it, but one of the things I struggled with was, how do I memorialize this experience, right? I can't plant a tree out in my yard because what if we move? Or what if the tree dies, and then that was this symbol for me, and I can't handle it. So I was like, how am I going to come up with a way to cope with this part of my life that's really not very fun? And it was really difficult, and luckily I went on to have 2 other children after that. But it was a really hard time. And it was kind of ironic because it was right at the same time that I was kind of starting to paint again. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to use the generativity of this experience to sort of be a way of coping with that. So I'm not going to I'm not going to buy some little sculpture. I'm not going to plant a tree, and how do you memorialize 7 ambiguous losses, right, in a way? But I was like, I can create things. And the more things I create, the more art I create, the more that expands. Like, it's not a legacy that shrinks, it's a legacy that expands. And, as I teach, it influences more people and they create more art. And so for me, I can look back on that experience and say, it was something really difficult that prompted me to spend more time creating. Not because I was directly being therapeutic with it, I wasn't painting out but it was just saying, I believe in creating things. When things are hard, you create things. And when you create things, it helps you make sense of them. And it helps you see your power in the world, even at times when you may feel you don't have a lot of power. And so I think there's great lessons to be learned in art as well. And I'm so grateful that I took art lessons growing up, and why I encourage everyone to paint, because I think the act of creating teaches us important things, right? It teaches us that you can always start over, right? You can always get a blank canvas. You can erase things. You can change things. It teaches you that there's lots of good ways to do something, right? It's a constant decision-making process. There's always new possibilities, new things to explore, and it changes the way you see the world. And so I'm so grateful for art in my life, because it's changed who I am as a person. It changes the way that I think. It changes the way that I approach all sorts of problems in life. It's made me a much more innovative thinker, whether it was, I'm on an advisory panel, and I was out in Utah last week brainstorming the best solutions for articulating the outcomes of liberal arts education for higher education, right? But I'm a great brainstormer because I'm an artist, right? Because that's what we do when we create art, is we think of new and different ways to do things. And so I'm so grateful that art teaches me that. So that's kind of what I have for you tonight. But I am open to any questions you have, or anything I can help you understand about the way I create art, or anything else.